This is Audible.
Blackstone Audio presents Dope Fiend by Donald Goines. This book is read by Kevin Kennerly. 1. The voices inside the flat were loud as the argument continued. Porky, black and horribly fat, stared around his domain with small, red reptilian eyes. His apartment was his castle. His world consisted of the narrow confines of the 4 walls that surrounded him. In his huge armchair, he would sit watching the drug addicts come and go. They entertained him. Not intentionally, but nevertheless they did. When they came to his shooting gallery and begged for credit, it gave him the feeling of power. With the women addicts, he enjoyed himself even more. When they were short of money, his fiendish mind came up with newer and more abnormal acts for them to entertain him with. He set aside the book he had been glancing through, laying it down in such a way that he could glance at the large color pictures of a horse and woman faking an act of copulation. The 4 addicts who had just bought a fourth of dope from his doorman were deep in an argument over who would use the 2 sets of works first. The rest of the tools were already in use by other addicts. "Here, baby," a dope fiend yelled across the room. "One of you can use my works, just as long as you don't stop them up." He hesitated, then added, "Just make sure you clean them out when you finish using them." To emphasize his point, he stuck the works back down in a glass of water sitting next to him and drew up a dropper full of water. He slowly skeeted it out on the floor, making sure the needle wasn't stopped up before loaning it out. "When you return them, Gene, make sure they work as good as they do now." He skeeted some more water out of the needle, showing the woman that his tools weren't stopped up. Porky watched their behavior without any show of emotion. It didn't disturb him to see bloody water skeeted on his floor, since it was already littered with cigarette butts and bloody toilet tissue. The floor of the apartment had pools of blood on it, from where addicts had tried to get a hit, but the works had stopped up, and they had pulled the needle out, leaving a flowing trail of blood that dropped down from their arms or necks and settled on the floor. From the accumulation of filth and old dried-up blood, the house had a reeking odor that was nauseous to anyone who hadn't smelled it before. Jean, a tall, brown-skinned addict who looked 10 years older than her 20 years, grabbed the works out of Joe's outstretched hand. Her face was still attractive, but one could discern marks of dissipation in it. Her lips were drawn down in a perpetual dope-fiend frown. Porky wet his huge, blubberish lips in anticipation. Jean was one of the few female addicts to come to his apartment who had trouble finding a vein to hit in. Because of this problem, she hit in the inner part of her thigh. He watched her greedily as she prepared to hit in the groin. She cooked up her dope in a large bottle top, almost burning her fingers when the top became too hot to hold, but not hot enough to make her drop her dope. She slowly rolled up a piece of cotton and dropped it inside the cooker. She drew the heroin up through the cotton. As her fingers moved delicately with the dropper, her eyes came up, and she caught Porky's eyes following her every motion. Her small mouth tightened sarcastically. She realized that he would continue to watch until she was finished, but she was far past the stage where she was concerned about such a small matter as a man looking under her dress. The only concern she had at the moment was whether or not she could get a hit. Without any embarrassment whatsoever, she pulled up her short skirt until it was above her hips, revealing the absence of panties, while displaying the tangled mass of dark hairs on her pubic mound. Anxiously, she began to run her finger up and down until she could feel the vein she was searching for. Without hesitation, she plunged the dull needle down into her groin. There was a blue-black scar on the inside of her thigh, which, at closer observation, was revealed to be needle marks from where she had hit before. In the middle of the track she plunged the needle into was a small abscess. As she pushed and pulled on the needle, trying to find the hit, pus ran out of the sore and down her leg. Porky watched the dark, fertile thighs with hunger. He had had Jean on many occasions, but she still aroused him with her complete disregard for what other people thought. He remembered the time she had put on a freak show with one of his large German police dogs. She performed in the front room before everyone, without any hesitation. Just the mention of the fourth of dope he was giving her set her right to work. The vivid picture of her and the dog on the floor came to his mind, and he grabbed himself and rocked back and forth. Small sounds of pleasure escaped from him as he imagined the dog between her black thighs. With an expression of exquisite pleasure, Jean sat back in her chair. She worked the dropper slowly, then let it fill back up with blood. When the blood reached the top of the dropper, she backed it up into her veins, working the blood in the dropper slowly as she jacked the works off. After she repeated this act over and over again, the junkie who had loaned her the works yelled, "I done told you, bitch, not to stop up my works! You keep jacking them off, they're gonna show us hell stop up!" Joe stood up and stared at her angrily. He was tall and thin, with dark features. His hair still held the accumulation of debris from where he had slept. Jean pulled the needle out slowly. A look of rapture filled her face. She looked up and noticed Porky holding himself and watching her. Her eyes filled with scorn. She opened her legs wide and scratched herself. "Why don't you come over here, Porky, and let me rub some of this pussy up against your fat black face?" She spoke in a slow, tantalizing voice, all the while rubbing the sides of her cunt. The sight was beyond vulgarity. It was grotesque, even sickening, because as she sat there with her legs wide, a stream of blood mixed with pus ran slowly down her thigh. Porky watched her as though he was in a trance. He licked his lips and moaned. His breathing became heavy and loud in the wide, spacious front room of the apartment. Most of the addicts sitting on the couches watched him with contempt, yet they weren't nodding too much to see. To them, Porky was just a fat freak with good dope. They used him the same way they would use anyone else to get their fix. They tried to play on his weakness. "Bitch!" Joe yelled at the woman as he walked over and snatched up his bloody works. "You done let all that motherfucking blood dry my spike!" He stared at her coldly. "A dope fiend bitch ain't shit," he stated, then walked back across the room and began to clean his tools out. A circus, Porky thought, as he watched another girl cross the room and sit down on the floor between Jean's legs. She raised her lips and kissed Jean's thigh. Her short skirt rose high on her hips as she nestled between Jean's spreading legs. As she raised her arm to stroke Jean's leg, a swarm of sores were revealed. On closer inspection, a person could see that each of the sores was an open abscess. The sleeves of her light-colored blouse were spotted with dried blood. As he watched, Porky's eyes began to roll. He reached down inside his pants and rubbed vigorously. The addicts watched Porky, anxiously hoping that he didn't reach a climax too soon. They knew that, at times when Porky felt freakiest, he might set enough dope out for everyone. Suddenly Jean dropped her skirt and stood up. Her eyes went across the room to Porky. His face was covered with sweat, while his double chin hung down quivering. His cheeks had become so fat that they hung down around his neck. "Set some dope out, Porky," Jean said in an unconcerned tone. "If you want to watch a freak show, lay it out, baby." Her face was hawk-like, with sharp black eyes. With instant control, Porky pulled himself together. His beady eyes glittered with animal cunning. Where before there had been lust, now only cruelty could be seen. "Smokey!" he yelled. His voice seemed shrill for such a huge person. The bedroom door opened, and a slim, dark-skinned woman in her early 30s came out. She had a look about her, as though she had seen all the horrors that life could reveal, and then experienced them. Her skin was dry and wrinkled, while her eyes had a flat, dead look about them. She moved across the room as though she was floating. The dope fiends watched Smokey out of the corners of their eyes. They knew it was the end of their thoughts of free dope. With Smokey there, nothing would be given away. The addicts, men and women alike, thought of Smokey as one of the dirtiest-hearted black bitches alive. Her eyes traveled around the room, missing nothing. Wherever she glanced, the addict who caught Smokey's eye quickly looked away. Smokey had tricked her way out of a cotton field in Georgia when she was 13. By the time she reached New York a year later, she was a professional whore and dope fiend. She took in Porky's appearance with a glance. His hand was still buried inside his pants. She removed his hand as she sat down on his huge lap, put her small hand behind her back, and reached down inside his pants. She manipulated her fingers dexterously as she swept the room with a cold glance. Her shrewd stare took in the blood dropping on the floor as one of the dope fiends nodded with a spike in his arm. In the corner, another addict was lying on the floor while his companion kneeled over him. His cheeks were puffed up as he tried to build up the vein in his neck. Slowly, he let out the air, then turned his head as his friend felt his neck, feeling for the vein. Using a size 28 needle, extra long, the addict's friend, Junior, stuck the long needle deeply into his partner's neck. Missing the vein, he removed the needle quickly and felt his friend's neck again. He held the vein with his middle finger and pushed the needle back into his companion's neck. Suddenly, blood began to flow up into the dropper, letting the man know that he had made a direct hit. He removed the dropper from the needle, leaving the needle still protruding from the addict's neck. He squirted the water out of the dropper and drew up some heroin from a top that was carefully placed beside the man on the floor. Gently, he replaced the dropper into the needle that was sticking out of his friend's neck, waiting until blood flowed up in the dropper again before releasing the drug slowly. Waiting for the reflow of blood was the only way he had of knowing if the works had stopped on him while he was changing stuff in the dropper. Twice more, Junior refilled the dropper from the top and ran the heroin into his partner's neck. He picked the top up and wiggled the dropper around, using it to suck up the last of the dope in the cotton. Junior had a good hit, because while the dropper was removed, blood gushed out of the open end of the needle. He stuck the dropper into the needle and ran the last of the dope. When he pulled the needle out, blood ran down the dope fiend's neck as he stretched out on the floor. It didn't disturb the addict, though. He just lay there until his partner used some toilet paper to wipe the blood from his neck. Porky let out a loud groan, and his monstrous body jerked uncontrollably. Smokey removed her hand and wiped it on her dirty skirt. She stuck her hand down inside her bra and removed a small package and opened it. The white powder looked innocent, lying there in the open, but this was the drug of the damned, the curse of mankind. Heroin, what some call smack, others junk, snow, stuff, poison, horse. It had different names, but it still had the same effect. To all of its users, it was slow death. Smokey stood up and swept the room with a brutal stare. Most of the addicts looked away. She was one of them, and they knew there was no story they could tell her, because she had heard them all. 2. The couple in the automobile was still arguing when the man driving parked in front of Porky's house. From outside, the house looked innocent enough, a small two-family flat with the downstairs flat boarded up. There were boards over all the windows in the downstairs apartment, giving it the appearance of having been closed for quite a while. Once there had been a fence around the place, but like many houses on the east side of Detroit, the fence had gone first, then the grass had followed. Now, there were only a few fence posts remaining in random spots around the front of the house. Teddy glanced at the small woman sitting beside him. "Terry, give me those other $2, and I'll get a $10 pack for us." The woman sitting beside him had the looks of a small doll. She was tiny, just under 5 feet, with jet-black hair that hung down around her shoulders. Her skin had a golden hue about it, impossible to acquire unless you were fortunate enough to be born with it. Her eyes, when she glanced up at the man with her, were bright and glittered with the joy of life and the happiness of being a woman in love. All of her features were small, and she had a habit of sticking her tongue out between her beautifully curved lips whenever she was deep in thought. Her smile held the promise of sweet sensuality and inward delights for the man lucky enough to receive her attention. At his words, Terry puckered her mouth in a tight frown. "I can't do that, Teddy. I've got to have gas money so I can drive back and forth to work." She crossed her legs, revealing lovely tan thighs. "Besides," she continued, "I already gave you $8 out of the $10 bill I borrowed from Mama. and I was supposed to make it last me the rest of the week. Oh, baby, Teddy whined. He stuck his lip out like a small child. Terry squinted up her nose. Shit, Teddy, you don't need all that dope anyway. For a moment, Teddy was too occupied considering the gas gauge to reply. You got enough gas, Terry, to get to work and back? He said. Come on, let's run up to Porky's and get a little blow. Again she frowned. Damn, Teddy, you know I don't want to go upstairs in that nasty house. The smell makes me sick. Plus that nasty, fat black bastard always tries to look up under my dress. She made a small gesture with her hand, then continued, Teddy, you know I hate the sight of all those people lying around on that dirty floor, with blood running all down their arms and legs. No, thank you, baby. I can think of 1,000 things I'd rather do this day than go up in that funky house. So please, Daddy, don't ask me to go up there with you. I'd rather wait in the car. Teddy didn't even bother to listen to what she had to say. If she didn't go up, he didn't have to give her any of the dope. But then again, if she went with him, he stood a better chance of hitting Porky up for a little credit. He tossed the idea around in his head. He was well aware of the fact that Porky was interested in Terry, but for that matter, Porky was interested in anything with a skirt on, and that didn't just go for women. Come on, he ordered, making his mind up at once. With Terry along, he just might be able to get enough stuff so that he wouldn't have to go out hustling the rest of the day. It was worth the chance. He didn't have anything to lose by trying. Terry shrugged. She knew that sound in his voice. It was always better to give in when Teddy spoke like that, because if she didn't, she ran the chance of getting slapped down. Or worse, they would end up arguing the rest of the day, until she went to work. She climbed out of the small, compact car, grumbling under her breath, and waited until Teddy came around the car. The look she tossed him was full of anger, but there was no hiding the love she held for her man. They were both just about the same size, with the same golden-brown complexions. At first sight, many people would take them to be brother and sister. He flashed his brilliant smile at her when he reached the sidewalk. Sometimes it made her happy just to be allowed to run with him. She didn't really care when he didn't take her anywhere. What she wanted was the enjoyment of just being with her man. You black men in Detroit are something else, Terry said as she grabbed his arm. If I can only figure out a way to get him away from all this dope, she thought. She remembered the beautiful times they'd had together before Teddy started using. She wondered again, for the 1,000th time, if Teddy had a habit. He claimed he didn't, but she didn't know. For one thing, she didn't know that much about dope to be able to tell if he had one or not. She believed he was becoming strung out, if he wasn't hooked yet. At the rate he was going, it was just a matter of time. If she could figure out some way to stop him from using, things would be just like they used to be. The little amount of heroin she took when she was out with him was nothing. She believed she was too strong to become addicted. Actually, the only reason she took the stuff was that Teddy liked her to turn on at times when he did. But other than that, she really didn't like the stuff. Sometimes it made her sick. She couldn't even hold any food in her stomach. Teddy took her arm and led her up the sidewalk towards the house. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. Self-consciously she noticed again that she was taller than he was whenever she wore her heels. She made a mental note not to wear her heels when he picked her up, unless they were going out somewhere. The thought of going out somewhere made her smile. They hadn't even been to a movie in the last month. She twisted around and stared at him. His thin face, with its keen nose, topped off by his deep, fierce, cold black eyes, was a woman's dream. His eyes gave him the look of a hunting eagle. When they reached the porch steps, she stopped. "I'll follow you," she said, and stood waiting patiently until Teddy went up the stairs first. They entered the frame house and went up the rickety stairway. By the time they reached the top, someone was already watching their approach out of one of the small peepholes that had been cut in the door of Porky's apartment. Terry wrinkled up her nose as the smell from the flat came to her. It was a sickening odor, stale blood, with whatever else happened to be on the floor. She wondered how the people living there could adjust to such an odor. She remembered the first time she had come up these steps with Teddy. The odor had been so strong, she'd almost vomited. Before Teddy could knock, they heard someone remove the 2x4 that was kept across the door, and then the door opened slowly. A feeling of nausea began to invade her soul as she entered the apartment. Terry swallowed, fighting down the sickness. For some reason, it was always this way when she entered this flat, or what she sometimes called jokingly the room of horror. The doorman closed the door behind them and replaced the large 2x4 across the doorway. Terry's sharp dark eyes darted around like flying sparrows as she scanned the room. It was the same as usual, the only difference being that the people changed. Other than that, they were doing the same things. It's like stepping into another world, she thought, as she stared around at the addicts, nodding and searching for veins to shoot the dope in. The people were strange. Men and women alike scratched whatever part of their body itched, no matter who might be watching. She stared at two white boys, who would have been conspicuous in any other all-black environment. But here, the color problem didn't really exist. A dope fiend was a dope fiend, whether he was black or not. If he had the money and was cool with Porky, he could relax and shoot his dope. Teddy grinned as Porky's voice came booming across the room. It was an artificial grin, one that many junkies have complete control of. Always smile when the pusher speaks. Very seldom can he do anything wrong.
Well, look who's finally came and visited little me,
Porky yelled from the bedroom doorway. They both turned in time to see Porky waddling out of the bedroom towards them. His fat face seemed to be the epitome of happiness as he crossed the living room floor towards them.
Teddy, you naughty boy, you. Why have you been keeping this lovely child away from me?
He stopped and wiped the sweat from his brow.
You know how much I enjoy looking at such a cute young thing as Terry.
His eyes swept up and down Terry's well-shaped body, stripping her of her clothes with his piercing, pig-like eyes. She managed to fight down a shiver of horror as she returned his stare. There was no way for her to conceal the fear she had of him. It was in her eyes, and she trembled slightly as she looked away from his hungry stare. To her, he was a monstrosity, fatter than any human being had a right to be. In truth, he was a good specimen of a freak of nature, grotesque to the sight, more fantastic in appearance than the mind could imagine. With his quick insight, Porky read the fear in her eyes, and it only aroused him. He rubbed himself intimately, unaware of the motion. Terry saw it, and turned her face away, paralyzed by the thought that he acted more like an animal than the huge dogs he kept in his bedroom.
Say, Porky, Teddy said in his most persuading voice, I ain't got but $10, man. You think you can toss in a little gapper for me and Terry?
Terry glared at him angrily. She hadn't asked for any dope, and she didn't want Porky giving her any. Instantly, she realized that this was the real reason Teddy had asked her to come up with him. It was not because he really wanted her company. He only tolerated her with him because he knew Porky liked her, and he was taking advantage of that fact. She could feel herself blushing as the anger welled up inside her. She tried not to let it show as she glared at Teddy, but from the smile on Porky's face, she believed he knew just how she felt. Amused, Porky stared at Teddy. He realized that Terry was the reason why Teddy asked for more dope than he would ordinarily have done. It would be a cold day in hell when one of these dope fiends started to outthink him, Porky thought coldly.
You know I'm going to look out for my little girl, Terry,
Porky replied easily. He grinned when he noticed her flinch. Yes, he would give her all the dope she wanted, and then some. The way he had it reasoned out, he didn't believe it would take long to get her strung out, not if she continued to snort the extra good dope he put her way, and he was definitely going to see that she snorted most of the dope he gave them. Porky glanced at Terry and smiled, while his mind quickly calculated up what he had in store for her. Just let her keep on chipping. One of these days, she would wake up with a little monkey on her back. That was the day in the future he was waiting and planning for.
Smokey,
he bellowed.
Bring me some of that loose stuff.
He waddled over to his large armchair and sat down. He waited until Smokey had come and gone before he shook out some white powder on top of a record cover. He pushed a large amount towards Teddy, then pulled it back and pushed a smaller amount towards Terry. "You know your woman has got to snort all of this stuff up, don't you, Teddy? I ain't about to have her saving none of my dope to give to you," he growled, then added, more in a joking manner, "I know how slick some of you try and be, so don't even try and slick me out of none of my dope. I'm up on you already." Teddy's hand shook as he reached out for the dope. "She's gonna snort it, Porky. You know I ain't trying to put no game on you, man." He stared at all the stuff Porky pushed over to him. He counted up the price the dope would have cost him. It was over 2 $10 spoons, at the least. All the time the two men were talking, Terry hadn't taken her eyes off the large pile of dope that she was supposed to snort. She had never snorted so much stuff at one time. She started to shake her head, but one look at Teddy was enough to make her change her mind. He was staring at the dope as though it had hypnotized him. "This is the last time," she promised herself, as she took the record cover and put it on her lap. She sat back in her chair and pulled out a book of matches. Tearing a small piece off the cover, she made a small shovel and began to snort the dope from the album cover. She frowned when a bitter taste filled her throat, but she continued putting the stuff in her nose. The strong drug began to take effect almost immediately. Porky began to breathe heavily as he watched her. Before, she had been sitting like a little lady, her legs held tightly together. But as the drug took effect, she slowly relaxed, and her beautiful golden-brown legs began to open, wider and wider. He stared openly. He could see the neat little slip she wore as her skirt rose up higher around her thighs. He whispered hoarsely to himself. The words were incoherent as spit ran out of the corners of his mouth. The slight flashes he saw of golden thighs were enough to arouse him to erection. He wanted to masturbate, but was afraid he would frighten her. He stared in fascination. No woman had ever really made him feel as Terry did. She was so tiny, yet so well put together. How fragile she appeared to be. Never had he met a woman whom he wanted to treat as though she was something rare, or so delicate that she aroused a tenderness inside of him that he hadn't been aware of. Terry could feel herself drifting off. It was as if she were in a fog, yet she was aware of her surroundings. She noticed Porky staring at her, and she tried to pull herself together. The drug was too powerful, or rather, gave her an attitude of indifference. The hell with it, she reasoned, and drifted off into a nod, as her head slowly dropped down on her chest. Teddy was too occupied to give them any thought. He rolled up his sleeve and felt until he found the vein he wanted. He removed a rag from his pocket, one that he used to tie up his hair when he got it processed, and tied it around his arm. With slow deliberation, he stuck the needle into his arm, hitting the vein on his first try. Blood backed up in the dropper before he started to run the drug into his arm. A look of peaceful contentment flooded his face as the drug quickly took effect. He removed the dropper from his needle and refilled it with smack, then stuck it back in his arm. The dope invaded his mind, bringing on a false empyrean. For a few hours, he wouldn't have any worries in the world. All his problems became insignificant as he fed the insatiable monster known to all users as their personal monkey. At one time, the sight of Teddy sticking the spike in his arm had been repugnant to Terry. Now, as the drug removed all of her unnecessary worry, she watched him out of half-opened eyes. If that was what he wanted to do, it shouldn't disturb me, she reasoned. Everybody was entitled to do his own thing, so who was she to complain? A slight disturbance occurred across the room. One of the young white boys passed out from too much stuff. As he fell out on the floor, someone yelled for Smokey. As his friend kneeled down over him, his hands moved quickly inside his partner's pockets. As Terry watched, she noticed him remove a small bankroll and stuff it into his own pocket. "Put it back!" The words were a sharp command. As the young white junkie looked up from the unconscious body of his friend, he saw Smokey bearing down on him. Her words came to him, sharp and clear. "Put it back, you son of a bitch!" she yelled. Yet it seemed as though she never raised her voice. "The first thing you'll tell him when he comes to is that he got beat up here." She stopped and stood on her heels, hands on her hips. "You don't think I'm gonna let you bring that heat down on top of us, do you?" She stared, not angrily, but with a look that let him know she wouldn't take any shit. "I wasn't going to keep it," the young addict replied. "I was just going to hold it for him until he gets himself together." Smokey held out her hand. "Give it here," she ordered, and nodded towards two of her housemen who had come over. "Get some salt or some ice under his nuts or something, but make sure that Peck don't die on us up here." She tapped her foot as she waited for the young white kid to hand over the money. "He'll get his money as soon as he's able to wake up enough to know he's got it back, but Peckerwood, I don't never want to see you in here again. You can wait until your friend is together and leave with him, but from now on, Hunky, find you somewhere else to go. We don't have no dipping in this house." The young boy looked around Smokey for Porky as he pushed the money towards her. His voice had a whine in it as he tried to explain, "For real, I wasn't taking this money, I was just going to hold it. You believe me, don't you, Porky? You know I wouldn't beat my friend. Look how many times we've come up here together." His eyes held a frantic note. He stared at Porky, pleading, waiting for him to say something that would remove the exile Smokey was forcing on him. Smokey didn't even bother to wait. She watched her two doormen work over the young kid. As soon as he started to moan, she turned on her heels. She stopped at the door of the bedroom. "You heard what I said. Don't let neither one of them honkies back in again. I done told you, Porky, they ain't nothing but trouble. If that Wood would have died, we have to close up shop, 'cause the police sure ain't gonna accept no young white boy dying from no overdose at our house." Porky shrugged his huge shoulders and looked away. Whenever Smokey spoke, he generally listened if it was about their business, because he knew that she damn well knew what she was talking about. He turned his back on the young boy's pleas. There wasn't a junkie in the world who could make him go against something his woman had said. 3. Terry walked slowly around her section in the department store as though she were in a dream. For the 1,000th time, her mind returned to the dope she had in her pocketbook. No matter how busy she tried to be, her mind would return to the tiny package. She counted slowly on her fingers. It had been 10 days since the incident occurred in Porky's apartment, where the white junkie passed out. Since then, Teddy had taken her by Porky's place every day so that he could get some dope, and she had ended snorting some stuff each day. She wondered if it was possible for her to have gotten a habit in such a short amount of time. No way, she told herself over and over again. But why did she keep thinking about the dope she had in her purse then? Why? Why? The question exploded in her mind. If only Porky hadn't given her that dope today when they had started to leave his place. She silently cursed Teddy and Porky as her mind dwelled on the dope in her purse. If she just took a little blow, Teddy would never know about it, she told herself. Before the thought had completely evolved in her mind, she found herself slipping away from her sweater counter. It was as though she were standing on the outside watching someone else. She hurried towards the women's restroom and locked herself in one of the stalls. Quickly, she removed the neatly wrapped package from her purse and spread it out on her lap. Her fingers trembled slightly as she rolled up a $1 bill, making it into a quill. She stuck one end of the quill in her nose, while she held the other end to the white powder in the package. As if by magic, the white powder disappeared as she inhaled. After 2 or 3 deep snorts, it suddenly occurred to her that there really wasn't enough stuff left in the package to take home to Teddy, so she quickly snorted up the rest of the dope. Her head dropped down on her bosom as she went into a deep nod. She stayed in the toilet, nodding, until she was awakened by the voice of one of her white friends who worked on the same floor with her. "Terry? Terry, are you in there?" The woman's excited voice came to her as though out of a dense fog. "Is everything all right?" You're not sick or something, are you? Terry lifted her head slowly. She could hardly keep her eyes open. The strong pee, pure, that Porky had given her was enough to bring the worst dope fiend into a dreamlike state. I'll be all right in a minute. I think I've got diarrhea or something. Her voice was low, and she slurred her words as she spoke. Is there anything I can do for you? The other salesgirl asked. No, I don't think so. Just let Mrs. Breeding know that I'm not feeling too well. Tell her I'll be out in a few moments. Terry waited until the sound of the door closing came to her. Then her head dropped again as she went into another nod. After what she thought to be just a few minutes passed, she stood up. Half an hour had gone by since the other salesgirl had spoken to her. She made her way to the face bowl and splashed cold water onto her face. While she was standing there, the door opened and the woman in charge of the floor came in. My, Terry, you do look a mess, don't you? Mrs. Breeding said kindly. If you're not feeling any better, you'd better take the rest of the day off. Terry fought back a nod as she stared up at the friendly, gray-haired white woman. I think I'll do just that, Mrs. Breeding. I'll stop in and see our family doctor before I come in tomorrow. For a moment, Terry's eyes closed. Then she continued, I don't really know what's the matter with me. Maybe it's something I ate. Mrs. Breeding stared at her closely. If I were you, Terry, I'd try and get a little more sleep. You young girls think you can stay up all night and it won't bother you the next day, but you're wrong. You need your rest just like the rest of us, even an old lady like me. Before Terry could answer, Mrs. Breeding added, You probably haven't noticed me, Terry, but I've been watching you lately and I've seen you actually going to sleep on your feet out there. Terry caught herself going into a nod. She jerked her head up sharply, not aware that Mrs. Breeding was watching her closely. I have been staying up late for the past few nights, she said lamely, as she thought, you nosy old bitch. Anxious not to be seen nodding, Terry splashed cold water on her face. She took her time washing until she heard the door close as her department head went out. She peered in the mirror at herself. Her eyes were as tiny as pinpoints. There was plenty of evidence of the drug user in them for anyone knowing the signs of drug abuse to see. Terry quickly got her coat and left the store before anyone else got a chance to see her. Once outside, she leaned against the building until her conscience got the best of her. What am I doing? She asked herself. Here I am, downtown, nodding against the wall of one of the largest white stores in the city. She tried to shake the drug off. All she wanted to do was find a place where she could sit and nod in peace. Her hair blew down in her face as she stood there nodding against the building. 2 young black teenagers walked past and smiled knowingly in her direction. The effect of the poisonous drug was still strong as she made her way to the nearest bus station. She cursed angrily at herself as she waited for the Woodward bus. If she hadn't been so stupid, she would never have allowed Teddy to keep her car. She waited patiently until a bus stopped in front of her. She climbed on the coach and found a seat in the back so that she wouldn't be under too many prying eyes. Her head became heavy, so she just let it drop down on her bosom as she went into a nod. Without being conscious of it, she began to scratch. Slowly at first. Then, without any apparent concern over who was watching, she scratched herself openly. She started on her leg, then went higher while she nodded. A young married couple on their way home from a theater watched her with amusement at first, but it quickly turned to embarrassment. Terry glanced up and saw them watching her. She tried to pull herself together. With difficulty, she fought off the desire to nod over and over again. 5 minutes later, she was back doing the same thing. The light chocolate-tanned skin on the upper part of her thigh showed long groove marks from where she had scratched herself. Her arms were also covered with the same scratch marks. I've got to get hold of myself, she told herself. I'm acting just like a dope fiend. Her guilty feeling was quickly forgotten as she began to feel nauseated from the motion of the bus. She reached up and pulled the cord and got on her feet, fighting down the urge to puke. To the shock of the people on the bus, she started to throw up before it came to a complete stop. When the bus finally stopped, she continued to puke as she went down the steps. People stared out the bus window at her as she jumped from the coach, puking all the way to the sidewalk. Her stomach seemed to be twisting in knots as she held onto a lamppost for support. She stared up and down well-lighted Woodward Avenue. The more she puked, the higher she became. She finished and stood up, her head feeling lighter, and walked as though she were gliding. Terry found a small handkerchief in her purse and wiped her mouth. The compelling desire to find a nice, secluded place to nod pushed her forward. She wanted to get away from all prying eyes and really enjoy her high. Such a feeling of exquisite peace came over her from the drug that the worry over her car and job disappeared. Terry hesitated on the sidewalk until suddenly everything was clear. When the thought hit her, it became compelling, and soon it took complete control. She believed she knew just what she needed. Another blow. If she could get another snort of dope, everything would be all right. Just another snort of stuff. She'd have a place to nod, plus there wouldn't be any funny stares. There was no more fear of Porky's place, even though she had never been there without Teddy. It was now a place of refuge, a place away from the unenlightened. The thought of being around people whom she could call her kind came to her, then jolted her wide awake. What did she mean by her kind of people? She wasn't a dope fiend. She was far too strong. The only people who got hooked were weak people, and she knew in her heart that she was too strong to get hooked. With that thought guiding her, she started to make her way towards Porky's. She opened her purse and counted the few remaining dollars as she staggered slightly down the street. One car and then another pulled up beside her. She didn't even bother to look up at the drivers as she counted the few remaining dollars she had. There was just a little over $8, but it would be more than enough, she told herself, especially if Porky was there. At that moment, she couldn't care if Porky stared at her legs or not, just as long as she got what she wanted. And what she wanted was another blow of heroin. Porky was sitting in his favorite spot at the window, watching the hotel across the street, when the cab pulled up. He always took an interest in cabs on his block, because dope fiends had a habit of riding up in a cab, leaving it in front of his house with the meter running, never to return. Whenever he caught one doing this, he made the addict go back out and pay the cab driver off. He didn't want any dope fiends burning up his house, even though he paid off the vice squad monthly to allow him to operate. He grinned when he saw Terry jump out of the cab. Her short miniskirt began to rise as she bent over and paid off the cab driver. Porky opened the window quickly and leaned out, trying to peep as her skirt went higher. He sat down disgustedly as she straightened up. His agile mind raced over the reasons that would bring her to his house by herself. There were only two, he told himself. If it had been Teddy she was looking for, she wouldn't have got out of the cab. She could see her car wasn't parked outside. The only other reason would be she wanted a blow. Whether or not it was a blow she wanted, he was planning to make sure she had one before leaving. He counted the days she had been using P. It was close to 2 weeks now that he had been giving her the best dope he had in the house. If she didn't have a habit yet, he was pretty sure she had a strong yearn. From his past experience with drug addicts, he knew a yearn was just as bad as having a habit. Whenever they reached the stage where the drug became compelling, it was just a matter of time before they became full-fledged addicts. When they got a yearn, they made all kinds of excuses to themselves to justify using. It was only a short step from mentally desiring heroin to physically needing it. Terry glanced up and down the street without slowing down. She didn't see her car anywhere, so she knew she wouldn't have to put up with Teddy's begging. She wondered idly as she went up the steps what was happening to her love life. Only a month ago, she would have given Teddy anything she possessed. Now his constant begging grew worrisome. Whenever she saw him, he needed money. He looked on her payday as if it were his. It had also been quite a while since he tried to take her to one of those cheap hotels he used to love to get her in. Well, that was one problem she didn't have to worry about anymore. The fear of getting knocked up by Teddy was over, because he didn't seem to be interested in her that way anymore. In fact, she thought, he really was interested in her no way, except in finding out how much money he could beg her out of. The door was open when she reached the top of the stairway. Porky was standing in the doorway, grinning.
"Well, now, what brings such a lovely thing as you to my house this time of the night, all by yourself?" he asked as he leered at her.
Her reply was quick and evasive. "I was looking for Teddy. I hoped to find him up here, Porky." She stared up at him and prayed that her nervousness wasn't noticeable. From constantly dealing with addicts, Porky had grown good at judging their behavior. He had difficulty with the hardened users, but as for the younger ones, he could read them like a book. Porky decided to make her squirm a little.
"You didn't see your car downstairs anywhere, did you?"
Before she could reply, he continued,
"If you had looked up, I would have saved you the trouble of coming up all them steps. It would have been no problem for me to yell down and tell you your sweet daddy wasn't here."
For a moment, a transitory shiver of fear ran through her. Suppose he refuses to sell me any dope, she thought anxiously. The thought of buying some dope had been just a notion before, but now, faced with the problem of maybe not copping, it became a driving force. She just had to cop some drugs now. "I was so sure Teddy would be here," she said, and turned on her most captivating smile. Her teeth had a dazzling whiteness about them, and, combined with her incomparable complexion, the smile was an enchanting weapon that had captured stronger men than Porky. "Really, Porky, I didn't even bother to look for my car," she added. "I was so sure he was here." Porky had seen the anxiety in her eyes, though. Before his knees gave him away, he stepped towards the door and pretended to get ready to close it on her.
"If he comes by, Terry, I'll tell him you stopped by looking for him."
Now the idea of having a blow became all-consuming. The very thought of being turned away, without being allowed to buy some stuff, filled her with dread. She clutched at the door desperately. She had never entertained the thought that he might not sell her a blow. She blocked the door with a small body. "I was thinking about wasting a few dollars on a blow for myself, Porky." She wet her lips and rushed on. "Unless you have some reason for not wanting to sell me some dope." She stared up at him and moved closer, not really aware of what she was doing.
Though he had expected it and waited for this minute,
the words coming from her sounded like a dream come true. Porky could hardly believe his eyes and ears. This was what he had been waiting for. At long last, Miss High and Mighty had been brought to her knees. All her ladylike behavior from the past would now be shattered, and he'd have the opportunity to watch her fall. With difficulty, he managed to conceal his pleasure.
"Why, by all means, girlie. You should know your money is good at my house. Ain't I been giving you a blow whenever you wanted one these past few days?"
He stared down at her as though he were a confessional preacher. His face was full of compassion and understanding. A few of the addicts sitting around the apartment glanced up. The byplay of words hadn't shot past them. All of them knew just what Porky was working out of. Minnie, a thin, short, brown-skinned dope fiend, in her late 20s, watched Porky with anger. She was well aware that he was playing with Terry. It seemed like a replay out of her past. The only difference was that it was a different pusher, but the same technique. Once they realized you really had a yen for the stuff, the free samples began to come to an end. When she had first started using, the pushers used to call her up, so she could come over and sample the dope they had just got in. They used to ask her to test it for them, as though she really knew what she was sampling. Minnie stared at Porky, her eyes glittering. She knew he wasn't stringing Terry out for the sake of another customer either. When it concerned a young, attractive girl, sex was the hidden key in the background of his warped mind.
"Don't just stand there, girl. Come on in,"
Porky ordered, standing in the doorway in such a way that she would have to squeeze against his huge stomach if she wanted to come in. He could feel her softness as she went by. He tried to press against her tightly while he reached out and rubbed her ass, making it seem as though it was a friendly pat.
"How much money was you planning on spending?"
he inquired as he walked closely behind her. Her short, light skirt fitted her tightly across the rear, and her legs were bowed enough to give her a very sexual look when she walked. Terry opened her purse and counted the few dollars there. pushing back the $5 bill so that he wouldn't see it. "I've got about $3, Porky. Counting the little change I've got. Damn!" she cursed. "I thought I had more than that," she said sweetly, playing on his lust. She could still feel the impression of his hand on her butt, and she planned on making him pay for that free feel. He grunted. "You know that ain't enough money to get no stuff with, girl." He sat down and patted the arm of the chair. "Come over here and sit down, Terry, while I try and figure out what we can do for you, short money and all." His fertile brain began to scheme. He didn't want to push it too fast, but this was an opportunity that didn't come to his house every day. Actually, this was the first time she had ever come to his pad without Teddy, and he didn't want to blow it. In the back of his mind, a small voice kept warning him not to rush. He had all the time in the world, because if she came once alone, she would come back again, if she wasn't frightened too bad. He wet his lips slowly, trying to decide what course to take. Minnie spoke up before he could make up his mind. "I'll put in the rest of the money with you, Terry, if you don't mind sharing a pack of stuff with me." Porky shot her a villainous glance, full of the promise of vengeance. He couldn't quite succeed in masking his anger at being temporarily thwarted, but he managed a slight grin. "By all means, you get together and pool up on one of those $10 packs." He stared at Minnie meaningfully. "I guess you know we done run out of $5 bags." He grinned ruthlessly. He knew Minnie hadn't planned on buying anything higher than a $5 pack. Minnie reached in her bra and removed some crumpled $1 bills. She counted the money out to Terry. With her back turned to Porky, Terry removed the $5 bill and showed it to Minnie. Both girls grinned at each other. After they pooled up the money, Terry took the money over and dropped it in Porky's fat lap. Porky stared at the money in his lap as though it were a snake someone had tossed on him. "Smokey!" he yelled, his voice ringing loudly in the flat. "Bitch, don't you never put no money on me no more." He yelled harshly at Terry, his voice carrying a note of fear. Like many pushers, Porky made it a point never to sell any drugs directly to an addict. Either his woman or one of his doormen always made the sale. Porky even refused to touch any of the money, believing that if a bus went down with phony money, his hands would not light up if they ran tests on him at the police station. Smokey came slowly into the room. She was wearing only a short half-slip and bra. She picked up the money quickly and counted it, making sure Minnie hadn't tried to shortchange them. She stared coldly at Terry out of half-closed eyes. There was contempt in her look. She despised women like Terry. She considered them as pampered bitches, never having really experienced any of the hardships of life. She remembered how it had been when she first met Porky. He was a small-time pusher, and she had come to his house broke and sick. He had taken her in, given her a place to stay, and enough dope to get her drug sickness off, then enough money to go to the doctor the next day. It had taken 2 weeks before the female trouble she had disappeared, and all that time, Porky supported her. It was the first time in her life anyone had ever been kind to her. "Is it all there, baby?" Porky asked, hoping in his heart that they were short. When Smokey nodded, he removed 2 $10 bags from his shirt pocket and gave one to Smokey. Smokey counted the money again, then took the pack and held it out to Terry. Before Terry could take the dope and walk away, Porky grabbed her arm and pulled her close. His breath was strong and hot as his yellowish teeth grinned up at her. "You take this other pack, Terry, and use it to wake up on." He pushed the other package of dope into her hand as she tried to pull away. He rubbed her arm slowly. A feeling of revulsion shook her as she felt his sweaty fingers caress her arm intimately, but it didn't occur to her to refuse the heroin. "Let's go over to my place and do this stuff up, Terry," Minnie said as she stood up. "That way we can get comfortable and relax without worrying about some freak trying to look under our skirts." Her open scorn had a strange effect on Porky. Instead of becoming angry, he became aroused. His breathing became heavy, and he stared at her with open hostility. "One of these days, bitch," he stated meaningfully, "you're going to overload your smart ass, and I'll be there to see it happen." The thought of Terry leaving before he could see her nod made him angry. There was genuine hatred in Minnie's eyes as she stared back at him. "Not living, nigger. As long as there are tricks in the street, I'll never put myself down so low as to have to ask you for any kind of favor," she continued, her voice dripping venom. "And if you think I give a fuck about buying my dope from you, forget it. I spend $50 a day every day, so I don't have to kiss nobody's ass to get them to accept my money. You know as well as I know, there are too many dealers in Detroit for me to have to get down on my knees to your fat ass. So whenever you feel as if you don't want my business, don't bite your tongue." Smokey had started back towards the bedroom, but stopped to listen to Minnie. "Tell that wise-ass bitch to take her business somewhere else, then," she yelled to Porky. "Like we really give a fuck about her funky $50. Porky hesitated for a brief minute. He didn't want to say something while he was angry that he would regret. She was a good customer, true enough, but $50 didn't mean shit to a man who had the business he had. If he put her up for keeps, he'd never have the chance to see her when she became sick, and he had no doubt about her one day having to come to him for help. Not if she kept using, and he was sure she'd continue using until the day she was arrested or the day they put dirt on top of her. He had put up with her sharp tongue now for over a year, so it shouldn't be too hard to put up with it for at least 6 more months. With her being pregnant, it shouldn't take that long. When the day did come, when she came begging him to take her to bed, he'd laugh in her face, and then make her perform with one of his dogs. The very thought of it was enough to cool down his anger. "Take care of your own damn business, Smokey," he yelled. But there was no anger in his voice. Terry stared at his scowling features. The very thought of him putting his large, blubbering lips on her was enough to fill her with revulsion. She stared at Smokey's departing back and wondered how the woman could possibly live with such a man. It only went to prove what they said was true. There was someone for everybody. "How far do you live from him, Minnie?" Terry asked. "I stay at the hotel across the street," Minnie answered, and started towards the door. "If Porky don't act funny and stop us from taking our stuff out, we can go over there and do up." The doorman opened the door for them, after Porky gave him a nod. Both women gave a sigh of relief as they left the shooting gallery. Terry stared at the old hotel curiously as they crossed the street. The front of it was sagging, as though it would fall over if a strong wind blew its way. The only thing that informed the passerby that it was a hotel was an old sign hanging from the dilapidated porch that read, "Transient Rooms for Rent." A sharp blast of wind almost lifted the short skirt Terry wore as they hurried across the street. She clutched her short, stylish coat around her and followed Minnie. They entered the hotel, and she glanced around. The inside was just as bad as the outside. Just past the entrance on the right was a check-in office. Actually, it was just a room, only the door was different. The top of the door opened, while the bottom part could be kept closed. Sitting behind the closed part of the door was an old woman, who looked as if she were part of the building. Her face was covered with wrinkles, and her head a ball of knotted gray hair. When she leered at them, she revealed a mouth completely empty of teeth. There were 2 or 3 snags that might have once upon a time been called teeth, but now there was nothing but yellow stumps inside her mouth. She waved a withered hand at Minnie. "My, honey, you ain't working tonight, huh?" she inquired in a voice that was much stronger than the frail body it came from. "Maybe later on tonight," Minnie replied over her shoulder as she led the way up some stairs. Once upstairs, they went down a narrow, dimly lit hallway. Minnie stopped at a door without a number on it. "I use this room for my tricks," she said in answer to Terry's surprised glance. "That's about all this hotel is used for, Terry. If you got a John who ain't got too much money, you can bring him here, and the old bitch downstairs won't charge you but $1 for the use of a room." Minnie opened the door as she talked, and they went in. "The only thing really wrong with the damn place," she continued, after closing the door behind them, "is the toilets. You have to use the one at the end of the hall. Ain't none of the rooms got a private John, but you get used to it." She tossed her light summer coat on the bed. "Sometimes it pays off. If a trick pays you beforehand, and you can get out of the room with the excuse that you're going to the toilet, well, it's just too damn bad for the trick. If he's that damn dumb, he needs to be took off." Terry examined the room as though it were an alien spaceship, Her upbringing had not prepared her for such poverty. Being from a middle-class black family, she had never seen the inside of such a place as this. The neighborhood she grew up in had been an interracial one since she was a child, and since most of the people in the neighborhood kept their homes and lawns up, no one was in a hurry to move. There were no deserted homes on her block, nor any bars or pawn shops in the immediate district. Terry's flashing eyes took in the tiny face bowl with a cracked mirror over it. An ancient dresser leaned against the wall, and, as she stared in its direction, 2 roaches ran from behind it and crawled into the wall. The only light in the room was given off by a small light bulb that hung down from the ceiling on a chain. Besides the bed and small chair, there was no other furniture in the bleak-looking room. Minnie took out her small package of heroin and opened it. She shook its contents onto an album cover. With a knife she removed from her bra, she split the white powder into 2 piles, pushing the smaller of the 2 towards Terry. Terry took the smaller share without complaint. Minnie walked over to the dresser and removed a small bundle wrapped up in an old sock. When she unwrapped the bundle, a large top plus a dropper and needle fell out. She came back to the bed and pushed her pile of dope into the cooker. Her fingers shook as she removed a piece of cotton from the mattress and rolled it into a tiny ball. "How about taking that glass and filling it up with fresh water for me, Terry?" Terry got up as though she were in a dream and did what she was bid. Her mind was beginning to reel under the impact of what she had done today. She came back to the bed and set the water down in front of Minnie. She picked up the album cover with her small amount of dope on it. With the end of a matchbook cover, she made a small shovel and picked up some of the dope and snorted it, all the while her eyes following Minnie with fascination. Minnie removed her shoe and started to rub her foot. She examined it closely, searching for a vein. She put water in her dropper after cooking up the heroin. She raised her foot onto the bed and stuck the needle into it. As Terry watched, she could feel herself starting to blush. She couldn't imagine herself sitting in front of another woman with her skirt up and her legs wide open. It was not because she was overly shy either. When she was in high school, it was nothing for her to undress in gym class with the rest of the girls. But this seemed vulgar and indecent. Minnie pulled the needle out and pushed it into another spot. Each time she withdrew it, a tiny stream of blood would flow from the spot she had just left. Blood began to fall into the dirty sheet, then run down to the floor. As Terry watched, her eyes became large as saucers. She stared at her new friend in horror. Cursing, Minnie snatched the needle out of her foot and began to rub her arm, searching desperately for a vein. Her eyes filled with anguish. Suddenly, she stopped and balled up her fist. She took an old stocking and tied up her hand. She made a small fist, then jabbed the needle into the back of her hand. She waited impatiently for the telltale mark of blood to back up into the dropper. When she didn't get any results, she pulled out the needle and tried another spot. In minutes, her hand was full of running blood. The blood dripped down on her bare legs and onto the bed and floor. She was becoming so frantic that she was almost in tears. She jumped up from the bed and rushed to the mirror. She ran back to the dresser and searched around until she came out with a long needle. She changed spikes on her dropper. Terry had almost forgotten the dope in her lap as she stared at Minnie in horror. Blood was everywhere, the floor, the dresser, and now the face bowl was covered with it, as Minnie stood over the bowl, staring into the mirror. Her fingers ran along the side of her neck, feeling for her jugular vein. Blood ran down her upraised arm as she plunged the extra-long needle into her neck. As she watched, Terry began to fight down the desire to puke. She jumped up from her chair, knocking over the album cover with the dope on it. She clutched her mouth with her hand, desperately trying to hold back the vomit, but before she could flee the room, vomit began to bubble through her tightly gripped fingers like a boiling liquid. 4. The warm sun came through the partially open window, tossing silhouettes on the wall. The sound of an angry fly buzzing around his head yanked Teddy back from his drug-ridden sleep and brought him wide awake. At first he tried to cover his head under a sheet, but the fly continued to buzz until he sat up and stared around his room in a daze. For a brief moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The sound of his mother knocking pots around in the kitchen and his sister's 3 kids playing loudly in the front room brought him to his senses. Teddy sat up in bed and reached over for a cigarette. He blew smoke through his nose as he began to plan his day. The first thought that came to him was getting his morning blow. He relaxed as he remembered that Porky had told him last night that he had given Terry a $10 pack to take home. He smiled as he thought about Terry. She would have taken it home so that he would have something to wake up on. How faithful a square bitch could be at times. I'll have to take the bitch to a motel pretty soon and give her some dick, he thought. For a minute, he tried to remember how long it had been since he had taken his woman anywhere, let alone to a motel. Oh well, the bitch should be happy just to be in his company, he decided, tossing his legs over the side of the bed and sitting up. With his morning fix already taken care of, Teddy started to plan the rest of the day. It would be nice to have a bowel movement, he thought, since he hadn't had one in over 10 days. After calling Terry, he decided he'd go into the toilet and make himself have one, even if he had to use his sister's douchebag and give himself an enema. He shivered. The sight of that long stem, and the thought of having to put it in his own rectum, sent goose pimples up and down his spine. But the idea of staying constipated any longer was out of the question. He had to have a bowel movement, and as long as he kept shooting dope as soon as he woke up, he'd never have an ordinary one. Somebody had told him that the longer his bowels stayed locked, the more dope it would take to make him high. He cursed, picked up the phone, and dialed Terry's number. After the 3rd ring, Terry's mother answered the phone. "Hello, Mrs. Wilson. Could I speak to Terry?" He cursed inwardly as she inquired about his health, his mother, and his sister's children. The goddamn woman would take all morning just asking about people's health. Finally, she yelled upstairs for her daughter. There was a long delay before the sound of Terry's sleepy voice came over the wire. "Terry," he ordered, "I want you to get up and come over here as soon as possible, baby." He remembered suddenly that he still had her car, but decided the hell with picking her up. It was warm outside, and she always kept a few dollars in her purse so she could catch a cab. "What for?" she asked, her voice no longer filled with sleep. "What for?" he cursed. "I want you to bring me that package Porky gave you for me." He yelled more harshly than he had planned. Terry hesitated for just a second. Her eyes went to her purse and back. The shock of many self-abuse had worn off, and now the thought of parting with that small package was disagreeable. Suddenly her mind was filled with a fierce desire to keep the small amount of dope. An unspoken warning ran through her, and she knew she would need it before the day was out. She wet her lips, thinking about taking a small blow now that she was awake. "I don't know nothing about a package Porky gave me for you. He gave me some stuff, but he sure didn't say anything about it being yours. And besides," she added, "Minnie and me snorted it up last night." "What?" Teddy asked, not wanting to believe what he had heard. When she repeated it, he could only hold the phone dumbfounded. Finally, it dawned on him that she didn't have any dope. Before the words had completely worked their way into his consciousness, his body began to react to the news. His nose began to run. He sniffed twice and slammed the receiver down as she started to inquire about her car. He cursed loudly. It was that goddamn dope fiend-ass bitch Minnie. A dope fiend bitch wasn't shit, he swore. He planted his feet firmly on the floor. All thoughts of trying to have a bowel movement had disappeared. His only thought was where he could get the money for a fix. He stared stupidly at the closet. He had pawned his last suit a week ago, so there wasn't anything left to pawn. He began to dress hurriedly. Something would have to be stolen and sold real quick. His knees began to feel stiff, and he knew he was becoming boogie. His mind raced feverishly. He had to have a fix. Suddenly his sister's voice drifted through the thin bedroom wall. Something in the back of his mind clicked. Bessie was inquiring about the mailman. Instantly it came to him. Today was the day for some of the ADC mothers to get their checks, and his sister was one of them. He thought about stealing the check, but just as quickly tossed the idea away. His sister was too sharp to let him beat her to the postman. Teddy stumbled out of the bedroom into the front room. They lived in a small 3-bedroom frame house. There were 6 of them, his mother his sister and her kids and him. He couldn't begin to remember what his father had looked like. When he was 4, his father was stabbed to death in the neighborhood bar. Since then, his mother and sister had worked, always making sure there was enough food in the house and that the place stayed clean. Sometimes he would steal enough stuff from various stores and bring some of the stolen meat home. Ham, lunch meat, steaks, it didn't matter. Whatever he stole, there was always some use for it at home. Though his mother would complain about his stealing, she always accepted the food. She knew if she didn't accept it, he would only take it out and sell it to one of the neighbors, who were always looking for some kid in the neighborhood to stop off with some hot meat. His sister Bessie stared at him. "Look what the cat drug in," she said coldly. "You better watch your purse, Mama. His nose is running, so he's looking for something to steal." "Why don't you shut your goddamn mouth?" Teddy yelled angrily, glaring at his sister. "You just shut your filthy mouth up, boy," his mother ordered from the clean little kitchen. "I done told you, Teddy, I ain't gonna have you swearing around these little kids like you ain't got no sense. You better get your mind right, boy, or either get out in the streets and stay with them bums you run around with." Teddy stared at his mother. For a moment, he wanted to cry. To be able to lay his head on her huge bosom and beg for help, for understanding. He needed someone to understand the hell he was caught up in. He stared at her short, squat figure and knew she would never understand. Her wide face would fill with concern, because she loved him. But she would never be able to understand his being strung out on a habit. Anything you couldn't control, leave it alone, she would say. She had once liked to drink, but after getting religious, she had quit. She believed firmly that that was all you had to do. Quit. On many occasions, she had tried to get him to go to church with her, believing that once he found God, the desire for dope would just disappear. He turned to his sister. "Bessie, I got to have $5. How about loaning it to me when your check comes?" Bessie snorted. "Huh, that's what you said last check day, and I ain't got my money back yet." She glanced out the window for the mailman. "You keep up with my check day better than I do." Bessie looked like a younger version of her mother. She was short and plump, with a round face. The only difference was that she had the same golden-brown complexion Teddy had, while their mother was dark. "Why don't you ask that Miss Fine you're always running around with? She got a job downtown and all them pretty clothes. That's where you ought to be trying to get your money from," Bessie stated, putting her hands on her hips. "I got 3 kids to support, and I sure can't take care of no dope fiend." "You got that wine-head nigger to support," Teddy yelled, losing his control. "You just keep on, and he's gonna put another baby in you." "It ain't none of your business what me and him do," she answered angrily. "And at least he ain't no damn dope fiend." Their mother came into the room, tossing her arms in the air. "You 2 kids is going to be the death of me yet, always arguing about nothing. Why, you carry on worse than the little ones, and that's a fact." She spoke to her daughter. "You better pay heed to what he said, too, Bessie. I don't want you coming up with no more babies." She remained silent for a moment. "And you ain't got no money to be giving that man either. If he comes sitting around here today, I'm sure gonna tell him about it." She turned on Teddy. "Ain't you got Terry's car out front? I seen it when I come back from the store," she said, not giving him time to answer. "Bessie May, you pay that boy something to take you and them kids to Kmart's so you can buy them some shoes and pants. Why, them boys of yours is running around with their feet on the ground." Bessie squirmed. "Oh, Mama, you know I can't keep them in shoes. They just run around outside and kick cans with them, and a week from now, they've been ran so much that the soles will be coming off." "I don't give a damn," her mother said unyieldingly. "You had 'em, and you gon' damn well take care of 'em. You hear me, girl? You ain't got too big for me to take a strap to, and don't you give me no sass." "You always starting something," Bessie said, turning and taking her anger out on Teddy. Their mother walked to the window and looked out. "You get them kids ready, 'cause the mailman will be here any minute." "Damn you," Bessie said softly, so that her mother couldn't hear. "I ain't gonna give you but $5 to take us shopping, Teddy," she said loudly over her shoulder. "Give me the money now," he ordered. "I'll be back by the time you get the kids ready." Her mocking laughter drifted back to him. "I wouldn't give you the time of day. You must think everybody in this world is a damn fool but you, don't you?" she asked harshly. Teddy started to pace up and down the small living room. His nose continued to run. Every 2 minutes, he would yell at his sister to hurry up. Finally, he walked into her small bedroom and started to help her dress the children. He dressed both the little boys while she dressed the girl. Bessie watched him, amused at his discomfort. "I don't know why you keep rushing, fool. We can't go nowhere until the mailman comes," she added sharply. "What's wrong, Teddy? That little monkey you got on your back done turned into a full-grown gorilla?" He wiped his nose on the back of his hand. "Don't worry about my thing. I can handle it," he replied arrogantly. She stared at him closely, her eyes suddenly filling with compassion. "Teddy, why don't you commit yourself to some hospital? You should be able to get help somewhere. You ain't doing nothing but throwing your life away now. Look at you. I used to be so proud of my little brother. You used to stay sharp, and people used to talk about what a sharp dresser you were. But now, since you've been using that dope, you ain't nothing but another dope fiend. You done pawned all your clothes or sold them. You don't keep your hair done anymore. All you want to do is fill your arm up with some of that dope and sit around scratching and nodding." "It ain't none of your business what I do," Teddy answered angrily. "You ain't nobody's prize either. All you do is keep your goddamn legs cocked up in the air. Every time some man looks at you hard, you come up pregnant." She flinched, as though someone had struck her. For a moment, it seemed as though she would cry. Teddy swallowed and wished he hadn't said what he had. But it was too late. She was hurt and getting madder every moment. The children stared first at one grown-up, and then the other. They hadn't understood what had been said, but they knew something was wrong. The sound of their mother calling them interrupted what could have become a very touchy affair. "Bessie, here come the mailman, girl!" They both rushed out of the bedroom, with the children running behind. As young as the children were, they'd come to realize that, on a certain day, the mailman became very important. It was a day in their lives when they knew they wouldn't be denied when they asked for candy money. Maybe a pop later on when they had dinner. Because of this, they looked forward to the mailman, too. After the mailman dropped the check off and left, Teddy went out to the car and waited. It wasn't long before he was blowing the car horn, trying to rush his sister up. She finally came out of the house, closely followed by the children. "God damn it, Teddy!" she yelled as she climbed in the car. "You ain't got to wake up the whole neighborhood just 'cause you want $5 funky." Teddy didn't reply. He knew that, now they were out of the house, he had better be careful about what he said to her. If she got mad, she would get out of the car and find someone else to take her out to the shopping center. And that would be the last he would see of that $5 bill. He removed a piece of toilet paper from his pocket and wiped his nose. He began to sweat under his arms. The sweat ran down inside his shirt, and he knew that it would have a rank odor to it. If he didn't hurry and get a fix, he would be too sick for a $5 pack to help him. He wasn't worried about getting high. What he wanted was a fix so that he could feel normal again. Later in the day, he would try to hustle enough money to get high, but for the moment, he had only one concern: to get the sickness off. Teddy pulled up and parked in front of the neighborhood store. The white merchant inside cashed all the checks for the women in the neighborhood. He had been dealing with the black people in the neighborhood for the past 30 years. When the city had rioted, and people were burning out the white businessmen in the slums, the black women of his neighborhood had surrounded the store and wouldn't allow the men to loot. Teddy and his crowd of friends had been there, wanting to take off all the meat, but his mother and sister were in the front of the crowd of women. They stayed up in shifts, protecting the store. The wineheads, who wanted the cheap wine free, and the dope fiends, who wanted whatever they could get to sell, called the women honky lovers, and whatever else they could think of. But it hadn't done any good. The next day when the owner came, expecting to see his store burned down or looted out, he cried when he found the women sitting out front joking. The women had displayed more sense than most of the men. They knew he was the only one they could turn to when their check money ran out. He carried them until the end of the month, and longer, when some of them had trouble out of their men over their checks. It was not surprising for some of them to have to owe as much as $60 or $70 out of their checks at the end of the month. Bessie went in and cashed her check. When she came out, she gave Teddy $5. She'd been mad at him before, but she knew she couldn't help herself. She had grown up in the neighborhood just as he had. She had seen junkies all her life. Her brother was sick, and she knew it. When she gave him the money, she also knew he would go to the nearest dope house before taking her to the shopping center. Teddy's hand shook as he reached for the money. "Thanks, baby," he said with genuine emotion in his voice. He drove away from the curb without bothering to look. A beer truck almost hit him. "God damn it, why don't you look where you're going?" he yelled out the window at the rear of the truck. When he parked in front of Porky's house, he prayed that Porky wouldn't be out of stuff. He met two addicts coming down the stairs as he ran up. "Is Porky all right?" he asked, breathlessly. "Yeah, man, he got some stuff," one of the addicts answered. Bessie waited impatiently in the car. After half an hour, she thought about blowing the horn, but she knew that it would be wrong. It would probably get Teddy in trouble with the dope man if she blew the horn in front of his house. When she had just about made up her mind to blow the horn anyway, she saw him coming down the steps. He came over to the car, grinning. The drug had made another man out of him. He was almost like his old self, friendly and easy to joke with. He slid in under the steering wheel. "I'm sorry, sis, if I stayed too long, but I had to wait until he had cut up some stuff." She sighed. It wouldn't do any good to complain. He'd given his excuse, and he probably thought that anyone would be able to understand why they had to wait almost an hour. The shopping center was crowded when they pulled into the parking lot. Teddy found a spot to park, not too far away, and they all climbed out. Bessie led the way into the store. Just like most women, once she entered the store, she lost all conception of time. Her eyes brightened, and she became obsessed with shopping. After an hour, she was still walking from counter to counter. After the second trip around the store, Teddy began to grow restless. "I thought you was going to buy the kids some shoes, Bessie," he asked. "We've been around this dress counter for the last 5 hours, he complained, exaggerating the time. She glanced over her shoulder at him, while she and another woman both tugged at the same dress. "In a moment, honey," she said, as she got a tighter grip on the dress. Teddy snorted, eyeing the dress rack coldly. They were too cheap to steal, unless he could get away with the whole rack. He watched the other woman's purse and wondered idly if he could dip on her before she noticed him. He disregarded the idea. Ever since entering the store, he'd been looking for something to steal. But whenever he got the opportunity, the merchandise was always too cheap to bother with. He promised himself that, before he left, he'd take something to get another blow off of. As soon as the woman turned loose her end of the dress, Bessie lost interest in it and turned away from the dress counter. It occurred to Teddy that women enjoyed shopping more for the sake of snatching something out of each other's hands than for really shopping. The PA system announced a sale on children's clothes. The mention of sale immediately caught the women's attention, and before the speaker had finished, there was a small stampede toward the children's department. Teddy watched his sister, amused. She was like a racehorse coming out of a stall. With a firm grip on each of her son's arms, she was off and running in the wake of many of the faster women shoppers. When they reached the sale counter, it was too crowded, so they walked over to the children's shoes. After new tennis shoes were put on the boys' feet, they didn't want to take them off. They started to cry when Bessie ordered them to take the shoes off. To prevent the children from crying, she let the boys keep their new shoes on. The little girl decided she wanted to wear hers too, so again she relented. She gave Teddy the old shoes to carry. They started for the checkout counter, but Bessie spotted an opening where the sale was going on and made a beeline for it. "Give me the money for the shoes, Bessie," Teddy said quickly. "I'll take the kids up front, so we won't still be at the end of the line when you get there." Without giving it any thought, she removed a $10 bill from her purse and gave it to him. "I'll catch up with you shortly, Teddy. I just want to get a few new outfits so the kids will have something to wear when school starts back." Teddy took the money. As he stood in the crowd of women, he dropped the boys' shoes on the floor, out of sight. He kicked them towards the front of the crowd of women. He pushed the kids up the aisle in front of him. When he got to the front counter, he stood on the side, not bothering to get in the line. He glanced around him casually. The old pair of girls' shoes were stuck down inside his shirt. With his jacket on, you couldn't even see a bulge. Without any apparent hurry, he started the children toward the nearest door. As soon as they reached the sidewalk, two white men stepped up beside him and grabbed his arms. Without any hurry, they ushered him and the children back in the store and led them to an office in the rear of the building. It had been done so neatly that very few people realized what was going on. A little later, when Bessie paid for her articles, another woman approached her as she left the checkout counter. They spoke briefly for a few moments. Then the woman led her toward the office in the back of the store. When Bessie entered the office, she saw her children standing around crying, while her brother leaned up against the wall as though nothing had happened. More ashamed than frightened, Bessie removed all of her sales slips and showed that she had paid for all of her purchases. "It must have been a misunderstanding," she pleaded. "Teddy must have thought that I was going to pay for the shoes." The store detectives watched her closely. The crying of the children was beginning to get on their nerves. "We don't have the slightest doubt in our minds about whether or not your brother was planning on stealing those shoes, miss. If he had intended on paying for them, why would he have bothered to conceal the old ones that the kids took off?" Bessie shrugged her shoulders. She felt like crying herself. Nothing like this had ever happened to her before. She was angry at Teddy, but she didn't want to see him go to jail. "Couldn't you let him go this time?" she pleaded. "I'm sure if you do, he'll never come back in your store again." She stared from one detective to the other, anxiously. The woman who had shown her the way to the office spoke up. "Could you pay for the shoes?" she asked. Bessie fumbled awkwardly with her purse. She snatched it open. "Here," she said, and held out a $20 bill. "This should be more than enough." The detectives glanced at each other. The older one spoke up sharply. "We'll give him a break this time, but if we ever see his face in here again," he said as he stared at Teddy, "we'll lock his ass up so fast he won't know what happened." Teddy sneered as Bessie followed him and the children out of the store. She believed that everyone in the store was watching them, and she blushed furiously. Before they had reached the car, her shame had turned to anger. "Give me my money!" she demanded sharply. Her voice was full of scorn and anger. Teddy felt the $10 bill in his pocket. "I lost it," he stated coldly, and continued on towards the car. 5. It was a hot, muggy day, and the sun was shining brightly through the windows. Terry put the vacuum cleaner in the closet and went back into the front room. Their home was a lovely house that ran in the $20,000 bracket. Her father kept the lawn beautiful, and her mother kept the inside of the house immaculate. The living room and dining room floors were covered with light brown, wall-to-wall carpeting, and boasted matching dark bronze French provincial furniture and golden drapes. The dining room table had a matching china cabinet. All gave the appearance of utter good taste. "Terry?" her mother called from the kitchen. "Have you finished yet?" "Yes, Mom," Terry replied as she flopped down on the couch. "You want me to make some chicken sandwiches for your lunch today?" "Don't worry, Mom. I'll probably buy something to eat at work. Lately I haven't been having any type of appetite." "You can say that again," her mother replied. Again and again her mind returned to the dope upstairs. She'd got out of bed and come downstairs to get away from the temptation, but the yearn for the drug was getting too big. All the while she'd been cleaning up, her mind kept returning to the heroin. It was becoming a fixation she couldn't quite get away from. Never before in her short life had she ever had such a desire. It was a nagging, constant thought, something she couldn't just dismiss. She sniffed and wondered if she was coming down with a cold. For the past half an hour she'd been sniffling. She promised herself that she would absolutely refuse to snort any dope for the next week. Yet before the promise had left her mind, she found herself climbing the stairs towards her bedroom. Her mother's voice drifted up the stairs. "What is it now, Mother?" she asked sharply. She couldn't keep the irritation out of her voice. Her father's voice reached her, even though it was muffled by the walls of the bathroom. "When did you start talking to your mother in that tone of voice, Terry?" he asked mildly. "I'm sorry, Father. I just have this awful headache today, and everything seems to annoy me," she yelled back down the stairs. "I'm going to lie down for a few minutes, Mom. If you want anything, I'll be in my room," she added. "My head is killing me." Before she could hear her mother's reply, she was in the bedroom. Terry locked the door behind her and rushed over to her purse. Her fingers shook as she took out the heroin and poured it onto a small face mirror. Quickly she rolled up a $1 bill and made a quill. With trembling hands, she began to snort the poisonous white powder. She made a face as the bitter taste came up in her throat, but it soon passed, and she began to feel the soothing effects of the drug. Terry lay back on the bed and put her feet up. She slowly lit a cigarette. Her eyes closed, and the cigarette dropped from her hand. Her head jerked up as the fire burned through her thin blouse. She caught the cigarette as it fell to the floor. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the door. She flinched